So you want to own a taxi company, buy a fleet of cars, slap on some paint and a rooftop light, hire drivers, and watch fares roll in from every corner of the city. That's the picture in your head. Guaranteed demand. People always need rides. The meter just keeps running. Here's the problem. The taxi industry has been hit by one of the most brutal disruptions any traditional business has faced in modern history. And the companies that survived didn't survive because taxis are inherently profitable. They survived because they figured out how to operate a genuinely strange asset, something that used to be worth more than a house in some cities and is now worth a fraction of that. A taxi company is not really a transportation business. It is a regulated asset licensing business, wrapped around a fleet of depreciating vehicles, and the moment you understand that difference, everything about how a taxi company used to make enormous money and how it now barely survives starts to make sense. Let's start with the price list, because just like every asset we've broken down before, taxi ownership comes in tiers, and understanding those tiers requires understanding the single strangest financial instrument in this entire industry, the medallion. In cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston, operating a taxi legally required owning or leasing a government-issued medallion, a physical license plate essentially, and the number of medallions issued was deliberately capped by the city to control supply. Because that supply was artificially restricted, while demand for taxis kept growing for decades, medallions became one of the most extraordinary appreciating assets in American history. In New York City, a single taxi medallion that cost a few $1,000s in the 1970s climbed to over $1 million at its peak around 2013 and 2014, meaning individual owner-operators, sometimes immigrant drivers who had saved for years, were sitting on assets worth more than most homes in the country, often financed through loans, specifically structured around that appreciating collateral. At the bottom tier sits the small, independent owner-operator, a single driver owning one medallion and one vehicle, essentially a sole proprietor. Above that sits the small fleet operator, owning a handful of medallions and vehicles, employing drivers on lease arrangements. At the top sits the large fleet company, owning dozens or hundreds of medallions, operating a genuine logistics and dispatch business layered on top of that asset base. Each of these was really a bet on the same underlying question for decades. How much is this artificially scarce government license actually worth? And that question got answered in the most brutal way imaginable, starting around 2014. Now here's where the naive mental model completely falls apart, because this is where the entire industry's economics inverted within just a few years. Ride-hailing apps entered major cities and did something taxi regulation had spent decades deliberately preventing. They added supply without any cap at all. Anyone with a car and a clean driving record could become a driver almost overnight, without buying a medallion, without waiting years on a city's restricted issuance list, without financing hundreds of thousands of dollars in artificially scarce collateral. This didn't just create competition, it fundamentally broke the scarcity premium that had made medallions valuable in the first place. In New York City, medallion values collapsed from over $1 million at their peak to under $200,000 within just a few years, and the human cost of that collapse was genuinely severe, since many owner-operators had taken out loans against medallion values near the peak, meaning they were suddenly holding debt far exceeding the collateral backing it. A phenomenon that led to a wave of medallion owner bankruptcies and, tragically, a documented cluster of driver suicides directly linked to the financial devastation, serious enough that New York City ultimately created a dedicated debt relief program specifically to help medallion owners restructure loans that had become mathematically impossible to repay. So if the medallion, the asset that used to define this entire business, has been financially gutted, how does a taxi company make any money today at all? The answer requires understanding the actual cost and revenue structure underneath the vehicles themselves, separate from the now largely symbolic medallion value. A taxi fleet vehicle, typically a durable sedan or minivan chosen specifically for high-mileage reliability, runs anywhere from $25,000 to $45,000 new and because taxis accumulate mileage at a dramatically faster rate than a personal vehicle, often running multiple shifts a day with different drivers, that vehicle depreciates and requires major mechanical service far sooner than a typical car, with many fleet operators cycling vehicles out of active service within just a few years, once maintenance costs start outpacing what the vehicle can still earn. Insurance for commercial taxi operation runs dramatically higher than personal auto insurance, given the vehicle is on the road far more hours per day and carrying paying passengers, and this single line item has become one of the most crushing fixed costs in the entire industry, particularly in cities with aggressive litigation environments around accident claims. The revenue model that's kept surviving taxi companies alive largely rests on the lease system, where a fleet owner leases a vehicle and medallion combination to an independent driver for a shift or a full day, collecting a fixed lease fee regardless of how much the driver actually earns in fares that day. This shifts the fare volatility risk almost entirely onto the driver rather than the fleet owner, meaning a slow, rainy Tuesday with few passengers is the driver's problem, not the company's, since the lease payment is due either way. A daily lease fee in a major market can run anywhere from $100 to $200 depending on the vehicle and shift, and a fleet owner running a dozen vehicles on consistent lease turnover has effectively built a steady, relatively predictable revenue stream that looks a lot more like a car rental business than a transportation company, which is genuinely the most accurate way to think about a surviving taxi fleet operation today. This is precisely why many taxi companies that survived the ride-hailing disruption pivoted hard into exactly this model, functionally becoming vehicle leasing operations for gig drivers, some of whom now drive for ride-hailing apps using vehicles leased from what used to be a traditional taxi fleet. An ironic twist, where the old incumbent business quietly became a supplier to the disruptor that nearly destroyed it. Airport and hotel contracts represent another meaningful revenue channel that has partially insulated some taxi operators from pure street hail and app competition, since many airports maintain regulated taxi queues and exclusive or semi-exclusive contracts requiring dedicated taxi permits separate from ride-hailing pickup zones, giving fleet operators with the right permits access to a captive, high-value customer base of travelers who may not have a ride-hailing app set up in an unfamiliar city, or who specifically prefer the regulated predictability of a metered taxi for an airport trip. These airport contracts often come with their own permit fees and queue management systems, but they represent one of the few remaining pockets where traditional taxi service retains genuine structural advantages over app-based competition. Regulatory compliance costs in this industry remain genuinely significant and represent one of the areas where traditional taxis still carry burdens that ride-hailing companies have often successfully lobbied to avoid or minimize in many jurisdictions. Vehicle inspections, driver background check renewals, medallion transfer fees, and city-specific licensing requirements all add ongoing administrative cost that a fleet operator has to manage across every single vehicle in their fleet. And in cities that still maintain meaningful taxi-specific regulation, compliance failures can result in vehicles being pulled from service entirely, creating real operational risk on top of the financial pressure already squeezing margins from every direction. The case studies in this industry tend to fall into two categories worth understanding. The first is the medallion owner who bought at or near the peak of the market around 2013, financed heavily against that inflated collateral value, and was financially devastated when ride-hailing collapsed medallion prices within a few short years. A genuinely tragic pattern that played out across thousands of individual owner-operators and became a significant municipal policy failure story, ultimately forcing city governments to step in, with debt forgiveness and restructuring programs, specifically because the human cost of the collapse had become impossible to ignore. The second is the fleet operator who pivoted early and aggressively, restructuring around the lease-to-gig-driver model, securing airport and corporate contracts that ride-hailing apps couldn't easily replicate, and treating the medallion as a sunk cost rather than an appreciating asset to be leveraged further, essentially rebuilding the business around vehicle logistics and fleet management rather than clinging to the old street hail economics that no longer existed. Time to pull it all together and answer the actual question: How much money do you make if you do this right in today's environment? In the realistic surviving fleet scenario, an operator running a dozen to 20 vehicles, primarily through the daily lease model to independent gig economy drivers, supplemented by airport contract access, can generate a genuine but modest profit margin once vehicle depreciation, insurance, maintenance, and compliance costs are accounted for, typically landing in the range of a steady low double-digit percentage return on the actual fleet and operational investment, a far cry from the extraordinary Medallion appreciation returns of the pre-2014 era, but a legitimate, sustainable small business nonetheless. In the legacy scenario, an owner still holding on to medallions purchased at peak valuation, unable or unwilling to restructure the underlying debt, continues facing a genuinely difficult financial position where the asset that was supposed to fund retirement instead represents an ongoing liability, a sobering reminder that even a government-created, artificially scarce monopoly license isn't immune to disruption when regulators allow a genuinely different competing model to enter the market unchecked. So if you're considering entering the taxi business today, remember the one thing that actually determines whether you succeed. It was never really about owning the medallion. It's about whether you've built a business around actual vehicle logistics and driver relationships, rather than betting on an artificially scarce license holding its value forever. Because in this industry, the asset everyone once assumed was the safest investment in the city turned out to be one of the most fragile.